Welcome to the latest episode of the Hunter Baumgardt Sports Podcast. My name is Hunter Baumgardt, your host. You can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at HunterBOnAir. Feel free to like the Facebook page as well if you haven't yet. Hunter Baumgardt Sports is the Facebook. And remember, you can watch or listen to the podcast. You can watch on YouTube or listen on SoundCloud. Simply search Hunter Baumgardt Sports Podcast. Well, today I am excited. We are officially in August, and that is the crazy part of all of this. We have entered, the fifth month of the Hunter Baumgardt Sports Podcast since we started in early March. So thanks so much for watching or listening during the first months of the podcast. I'm excited for today's episode. Nate Meihak is joining us. He is a new sports reporter up at WJFW-Newswatch 12 in Rhinelander, Wisconsin. So I'm excited to hear about his new job, kind of the day in, day out of having a new sports reporter job during a pandemic. How's that been? I think he's doing a little news and sports there. So we'll talk about that. And also, of course, get his take on the Brewers, the Packers, the Bucks. Does he think there's going to be a college football season? All of that we're going to get into in a really fun discussion with my friend Nate Meihak, fellow UWL graduate. And so let's get to it, right? With no further ado, here is Nate Meihak from Newswatch 12. Joining me on the Hunter Baumgardt Sports Podcast this week is Nate Meihak, a fellow graduate of UW-La Crosse and sports reporter at WJFW at Newswatch 12 in Rhinelander, Wisconsin. Nate, you can follow him on Twitter at Nate Meihak, just simply his name, Meihak, spelled M-E-I-H-A-K. Nate, really appreciate the time today and excited to learn about your new gig up there in Rhinelander and talk about some Wisconsin sports here.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I appreciate you having me on. I didn't think I was big enough yet. You've got some pretty big names so far on the show, so I appreciate you taking the time to let me come on.
Oh, of course. Wanted to talk to you, and you're just as much of a Wisconsin sports personality as anyone else. So don't slight yourself. So, but I do want to first congratulations on your new job. How has it been moving to a new city and getting into a new job that's specifically supposed to be for sports, but during a pandemic and during a time when sports isn't necessarily going on as much as usual?
It's been the thing about Rhinelander is obviously coming from La Crosse, it's very quiet. I think La Crosse, you're looking at 51,000 people for a population, and here in Rhinelander, it's about 8,000. So, I mean, it's a huge difference in terms of just the hustle and bustle isn't there like it was at La Crosse. But the funny thing is that where I'm from originally, Wapaka, it's very similar to Rhinelander in the terms of a lot of lakes, a lot of tourists, especially now in the summer. A lot of people come up to the Northwoods, as we call it, to see the lakes, to see all like the fun little touristy stuff. It's been a little quiet this summer, as you can imagine, but even in the winter too, I mean, like snowmobiling, ice fishing, that's all big things going on up here. So there's still stuff going on. It's a little more quiet than I'm used to, but you can find stuff if you look hard enough for it. And yeah, and like kind of as you were saying too, I was hired as a sports reporter. Not exactly what's happening right now, just because of the pandemic. There's a lot of sports that aren't happening. So hopefully, especially with the WIAA decision last week, hopefully once fall sports season starts to hit, things will ramp up a little bit more, and we'll be back to sports full time. But I'm kind of bouncing right now between news and sports, which I worked in sports. That's what I went to school for. So having to do news is a little bit more of a getting your feet wet than I was expecting, kind of a moment for me. But I think I've adjusted well. I mean, I've been doing it for a few weeks now, and it's, I don't have any complaints about it other than I wish sports were back. But, I think it's been a tough adjustment, but I think I'll be more well-rounded because of it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. I watched one of your news stories as well, and it looked just as good as one of your sports stories. So, yes, yes, no problem. So you are, doing well with that. I wanted to ask you as well, kind of going hand in hand with that, what's kind of your day-to-day as a reporter up there at WJFW? What's kind of give the audience, if you will, a kind of a sneak peek into the behind the scenes?
Yeah, look behind the curtain. So
yes.
So really, my schedule's a little weird right now because I work Wednesdays through Sundays. I'm off Mondays and Tuesdays. So I usually spend my weekends, well, I mean, I try to do some fun things like get outside and get some exercise or do whatever. But I usually try to take at least an hour each day on my weekends, just setting up what my week is going to look like in terms of stories.
Mm.
And so right now, since I'm kind of bouncing between sports and news, it could really be anything. It could be local politics, local events, sports, up in Minocqua or wherever. So I
Mm-hmm.
really just try to balance it and find what I can find. And the weird thing is, like, if I'm looking at sports, there's a good chance that I'll be working a night shift that night, just because
Mm-hmm.
sports happen at night typically.
Yeah.
News typically happens during the day. So sometimes I might look and say, oh, I'm going to be covering this sporting event on Tuesday night, and I won't get out of there till 11, and then I have to bounce back and do a news story the next morning. I'm going to try to push that back towards like 10:30, just so I can
Sure.
get an extra hour of sleep, because those quick turnarounds are tough. But
Mm-hmm.
essentially, I just have to go wherever the story is, and it doesn't really matter where or when it is. But usually try to get back, go out, film the story, get my interviews, get back to the station around early afternoon, 2-ish. That 2 is kind of pushing it. Have my story done for the 5 and 6 o'clock shows,
Mm.
um, and then I'm out of there. So I mean, it's a lot of editing, which learning a new software isn't always the easiest thing, but
Mm-hmm.
you're trying to learn the ins and outs of everything. So um, it changes a lot day to day right now, especially just because I'm bouncing between news and sports.
Sure.
Once I get into sports, it'll be likely more nights that I'm going to be working, and that's fine with me. Have a
Mm-hmm.
little bit more free time during the day, which is cool. So right now, it's kind of in flux what my day to day routine looks like.
Sure.
But so I'll get my stories in the morning, come back, have some food, edit during the afternoon, get it out for the 5 and 6 o'clock shows, and hit my deadlines. So it's been a weird adjustment coming from sports to doing that, but I'm starting to get used to it now. I'm on like week 3 of doing that. So
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense. I'm curious too with sports. Are you covering, and or I guess will you cover once some of these major sports come back? Kind of like the I guess the Packers, Brewers, Bucks of the world. Are you on any of these Zoom calls or interviews with the managers at all, or is it more very local focused there at WJFW?
well, we try to stay locally focused
Mm-hmm.
if we can, especially, like there's a lot of really cool stories going on in this area. Like you
Yeah.
would think in an area where there's not many people, there's not a lot of stories to cover, but the more you kind of learn and reach out and just talk to the people that live up here, you learn that there's some really cool people that have some really cool backgrounds, or some really cool obstacles that they've overcome in their
Mm-hmm.
lifetime to get to where they are, whether that's in news or within sports or whatever it might be. So we try to find those really cool personal stories to tell. And if it's, and I am a sports reporter, but our philosophy, I guess, is like, hey, like, yeah, this kid might be playing basketball. Like, it might seem on the surface like it's a basketball story, but really we want to tell a story about how, he's coming back from injury, and maybe he had a personal
Mm.
tragedy within his family and how he's overcoming that. Like, that's something everyone can relate to, not just a
Yeah.
sports fan or a basketball fan. We want to find those stories. And, it doesn't always have to be heartbreaking and stuff like that. But
Yeah.
if it's something like, hey, like this girl broke a state record in cross country, well, hey, that's pretty cool. Let's go tell that story, and how she trained to get there and how she worked to get to that point.
Mm-hmm.
That's not necessarily a sports story. It's more of just like how do you better yourself? That's something that everyone can relate to. So we're trying to find those personal stories, and maybe the vehicle is a sporting event or an athlete, but it's a story that everybody can relate to.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of what we're trying to do up here, especially within the local market, just because there's not as many media outlets in an area like Rhinelander or in the Northwood. So, we are kind of like the voice for people up here to share those thoughts, those stories, those ideas that they might have. And that's like a really cool, like, responsibility I think that we have.
Mm-hmm.
Now, obviously we do the Packers, the Bucks, the Badgers, the Brewers. I mean, those are the money makers, right? That's what people care about. But
Mm-hmm.
if we find something local, that's always going to trump a national news
Mm-hmm.
story like that, just because it's something people want to hear about. They want to hear what's going on in their own backyard.
Is that something you like, and you might not know this yet because obviously you're just starting, but how do you like find out about something like that, right? Because you can't go up to every team person on the basketball team and say, "Hey, have you broken a leg before? Hey, have you," just to see who's, done what. So how does that story come out? Because a lot of us, we all see that on the evening news is stories about those deeper levels of these athletes.
Yeah, and I mean that's definitely a tough part, especially being
Mm-hmm.
new, as you kind of mentioned. So, I mean, a lot of it is people reach out to us, which is really helpful, just
Mm.
because they know that we're always trying to find that stuff, and they think like, "Hey, I know about so and so. You should reach out. They're doing this really cool event to raise money for this organization. It'd be really
Mm-hmm.
awesome if you could get out there." And like, yeah, that's great. Like, we'd love to cover that. And then as you go and you talk to those people, they might mention, oh yeah, I'm doing this
Mm.
because of, personally for me, this organization means so much because in my lifetime I've gone through this and this. And you go, wow, like that's actually really like emotional. Like, let's get more into that. Or maybe then I can follow up and do a different story on that person. So you just kind of build those connections based off of what you do. And then obviously a lot of the coaches, the athletic directors in the area, they know who we are. So if they think like, hey, like I got a kid on our team who
Mm.
is doing this, or like they've gone through this the past off season, like you should come out and interview them. I think they'd be up for it. I can ask them, absolutely. Like, we'll take your suggestion. You're around these kids way more than we ever are. So you
Mm-hmm.
know them better than us. So if you think like, hey, I think this kid has a really cool story and I would love for the greater community to hear about it, let us know. I mean, it's just building those connections and having those conversations with people. You learn a lot more just interviewing and meeting people than you'd ever expect.
Sure. Okay. That makes a lot of sense. Nate Meihak joining us. He is a sports reporter at WJFW Newswatch 12 in Rhinelander, Wisconsin. You can follow him on Twitter at Nate Meihak. So let's transition to some sports topics, some Wisconsin sports topics. Let's go local sports first. The WIAA pushed back started practice September 7th, correct? That's where their target date is, or somewhere around there?
Yeah, so for high risk sports, which will be
Mm.
football, volleyball, and soccer, and they categorize those as where sports where kids are going to be in close proximity together. So
Mm.
obviously football, they're hitting each other. Soccer, you're defending, and then volleyball, you're all on one court together. So high risk sports are pushed back to September 17th. The
Okay.
low risk ones like golf, swimming, tennis, and cross country, I believe it's August 17th is the
Okay.
day that they can start practice. It's either the 17th or the 18th. I can't remember off the top of my head,
Sure.
but both of those have been pushed back to later dates. But as of right now, there's going to be a season at least through the WIAA. But really, it's going to be up to the school districts and the superintendents whether or not they
Mm-hmm.
feel comfortable putting their kids out there and letting them compete. So we still have yet to see, especially in our area, whether or not we're going to see a lot of schools competing. I know Madison, I believe yesterday actually just came out and said they're not going to have any fall sports this year, all of the Madison schools. So there's
Mm.
been rumors about other areas that aren't going to do fall sports and kind of follow the Madison route. Again, those are just rumors, so I don't really want to spread anything that I can't
Mm-hmm.
really prove with any concrete evidence. But I wouldn't be surprised if other areas follow suit, like Madison.
Mm-hmm. I was going to ask you, like, do you think some parts of the state will have football this year? Like, do you think some parts will and some parts won't, or do you think this is going to be a statewide deal?
I and I mean, I'm kind of basing this off of what I've heard.
Yeah, that's for
It's all
sure.
rumors right now, so it's
Yeah.
kind of you're making assumptions. But I do think some parts of the state will have football.
Mm-hmm.
I also think a lot of more highly populated areas are going to say no, we don't trust it, or just areas
Mm-hmm.
where uh, COVID-19 has hit really hard, especially with this sort of like second wave we've seen in the last
Mm-hmm.
month or so. So there will be football. I'm like 99% positive of it. There will be schools that are playing football this year,
Mm-hmm.
but I think we will see a lot more schools follow suit though what Madison is doing and not allow their athletes to compete in the fall season. So whether or not they decide to push it to the spring, because I believe the
Mm,
WIAA is letting teams do that if they so choose.
mm,
So there's a very good chance we might see a spring season and a fall season, especially for football. But
mm.
I'm confident that there will be at least enough teams playing in the fall for football that will have a season. And I
Sure.
mean, fingers crossed, knock on wood, barring any catastrophes and any outbreaks, I think they'll at least finish a season.
Hmm.
So we'll see it. It's just a matter of how many teams and how many teams decide to push it off to the spring. It'll be weird, but we should have a season.
Yeah, sounds good. Nate Meihak joining us. Now, I want to move into some professional sports teams here in Wisconsin, starting with the Brewers. Obviously, they just started about week and a half ago or so. So the we've seen some all different stuff with the Brewers. Some good pitching, some bad pitching, some good hitting, some bad hitting, some good fielding, some bad fielding. What's kind of your take on the Brewers? Do you think they're going to kind of hover around 500 throughout the season, and this is kind of what this team is?
I know it's like the most boring answer possible, but yeah, I honestly I think it could very well be. I mean, you look at the lineup, and it's not a lineup that's gonna wow you. I mean, you lost Grandal, you lost
Hmm.
Moustakas, two guys that were super productive last season for this team, and I thought that was gonna be a major blow to their offense, and I think it will be. I think a lot of their success is going to kind of ride on that pitching staff, on that
Hmm.
bullpen, which, I mean, they've lost some pieces as well within the last year. So, I think it has yet to be determined what this pitching staff is going to be. Just because, as you mentioned, we've seen a little bit of everything from them off of the
Yeah.
mound this year. So I think they're going to go as far as the pitching allows them to go.
Mm.
Um, you know, Yelich is in a slump right now. I know some people are kind of a little worried about. He'll go on a tear within the next week or 2 weeks, where everyone's like, "Oh, Christian Yelich, like he's doing exactly what we expected."
Hmm.
That's my bold prediction, I guess you could say, for Christian Yelich. So I'm not too worried about him, but I am worried about the rest of the lineup, just because I don't know if they can make up that production that Moose and Grandal gave them last year, and so
Mm.
I think a lot of that burden is going to end up falling on the pitching staff. And I think, they'll be competitive in the NL Central. The NL Central is going to be a bloodbath this year. I think we all knew that. We all expected it. So the pitching staff is going to have to step up. And if they want to compete and they want to potentially get into the playoffs, which they're doing the expanded playoffs, so I think there's
Hmm.
still a very good chance they'll make it into at least postseason play. Pitching staff is going to give us some headaches, and then other days like last night with Brandon Woodruff is going to make us say, "Wow, like this team can make a run." But
Hmm.
it's going to fall on the pitching, I think.
Hmm. That totally makes sense. How about the Bucks? They're obviously restarting now in Orlando, and they are the runaway favorite for the one seed in the East. These regular season games are kind of a tune-up for them. Do you expect once the postseason gets going and we get into late August and September, do you expect that this team is representing the East in the finals, even though we've had this 4-month break?
I do. I really do, because I mean, even in the scrimmages they've had like the last week or so, they've been
Hmm.
dominant at times. So I mean, it doesn't really look like they've missed a beat at all. And I mean, it's tough to gauge because it is a scrimmage, so you don't really know. And I believe they have 8 regular
Yeah.
season games before the playoffs start. So, they still have a little bit more time to tune up. And I do think they'll have the one seed in the East. I do think they're going to be the team to beat. And if they run into a Boston or a Toronto, they're going to be competitive series.
Hmm.
Milwaukee's not going to steamroll through those teams, especially in a series long, at least 4 games. It's not going to happen. But I still think the Bucks are the favorite in the East. There's no
Hmm.
question about that. Um, I expect this team to represent the Eastern Conference in the finals this year. Now, whether or not they win the finals has yet to be determined. I think, the West is going to be very good, very competitive with the Lakers, the Clippers, and whoever else might be coming out of there.
Hmm.
So the Bucks, I think the Bucks will win the East. Not sure who's going to win the West, but regardless of who they play, the finals are going to be a tight series. Whether it's
Yeah.
the Clippers, whether it's the Lakers, the Bucks aren't going to roll through the entire NBA and win a championship this year. I do think they'll get through the East, but it's going to
Hmm.
be tough. And I actually said back in March, like a week or two before everything kind of got shut down. But I truly believe, and I still hold this belief, that the one guy I think will kind of be a difference maker for the Bucks this postseason. You know, everyone's thinking Giannis and Middleton and
Hmm.
Bledsoe. I think the guy that is going to make a difference, be like an X factor for the Bucks, is going to be Dante DiVincenzo, just
Mm.
because of the energy he brings, offensively, defensively. You know, he's not a star by any means, but he makes those plays every once in a while that kind of make you go, "Oh, Dante's like, you know, he's coming out to play today." And he reminds me a little bit, maybe not so much in the play style, but I guess the best way I could compare him is Matthew Dellavedova in the 2015 finals, who
Mm.
kind of came out of nowhere and was just that spark for the Cavs, especially once Kyrie and Kevin Love went down, to kind of give LeBron that
Yep.
second outlet really for the
Yeah.
offense and for the defense. Just that high energy player who once in a while is going to make a play that brings the crowd to its feet. I guess we don't really have to worry about a crowd this year, but just kind of is that motivating factor for the entire team, and that's I feel like Dante can really fit that role, especially in the postseason. He's going to be the X factor this year. That's my belief.
I like that take, and I think we've seen it so far throughout the games that we've seen is just his energy, his defense is getting better.
Yeah.
He's just really improving, and it's nice to see a draft pick do that for the Milwaukee Bucks. Nate Meihak joining us for just a couple more minutes here. Finally, with the Green Bay Packers, obviously they're reporting at training camp. We'll see how this goes. Obviously they're doing the no bubble where they're traveling all around, and we've seen the MLB have some struggles. We'll see if the NFL does that. If they are able to play this year, last year was a year where the Packers went 13-3, but everybody was getting on them worst 13-3 team ever, which I don't agree with, but that was, that's what people like to run with. But how do you see this season going if they make it, if they make it through safely? Do you see a 13-3 team again, or is this going to fall back to maybe 12, 11, 10, even 9 wins?
I mean, I do think the whole worst 13-3 team ever was it felt like a knock against the Packers, making them sound a lot worse than they were. And they were a good team, and I will say that maybe they overperformed by a couple of wins. I believe in one-score games last year, they were 7-1. They had some
Mm,
ridiculous winning percentage in one-score games, and that's just not the average in the NFL. It doesn't really matter how good you are. If you perform that well, you're going to come down to earth. You're going to drop a game or two here. And it doesn't really matter how good you are. It could just be a fluky penalty. It could be a juggling catch in the final 2 minutes that sets up another team for a game winning field goal. There's
mm-hmm.
so many things that can kind of go your way or go against you in one score game. So, they're going to lose a couple more this year. They're not going to be 13-3 again, but I still think they're a team with enough talent to have a winning record to compete for a division title. I don't know if they will win the division, but I
Sure.
do know that they can at least finish within contention for it. I think they are a playoff team. They're capable of making the playoffs. So, they're a team that I think largely is dependent on if the receivers step up. That's kind of the boring answer because that's what
Mm-hmm.
everyone says, but also what defense we see, because it seemed like week to week last year you'd see a very dominant team. The pass rush is getting home, taking the stress off of the secondary, and then other times, they were getting picked apart, and the running game was just killing them.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like they made some good acquisitions, especially on the defensive side of the ball this past off season. So the defense, if they can be a little bit more consistent, that'll help them win more games than not, and especially as I was just talking about with those one score games. So they're a team that I can see in the 10-11 win ballpark.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe they get a lucky bounce here and there, win 12. But they're a team that is built to have a winning record. So they're going to be a good team. Knock on wood that we see a full season. I don't really know how it's going to work. I'm a
Yeah.
little nervous about it. Um, but if they do get a full 16 games in, they'll be a good team. They'll compete for a division title.
I definitely agree. Nate, I really appreciate the time talking about local sports, your job, and of course the Bucks, Brewers, and Packers as well. And well, actually, one more question.
Yeah.
Let's ask about. I'm curious to hear your take. Do you think there's college football this fall?
I don't know. I really don't know. It's weird right now because I know the Big Ten, the Pac-12, they both already said we're doing conference games only. So
Mm-hmm.
you're missing out on some really cool events like the games at Lambeau, the games at
Yeah.
I believe at Wrigley Field is when
Mm-hmm.
Wisconsin was supposed to play Illinois. So I mean you're gonna miss out on those events. But I think I think there will be college football this year. I think we're going to see a lot more. I mean, we've already started to see it with NFL players opting out. I think we'll
Yeah.
see more college kids maybe opt out than we do in the
Mm.
NFL just because they're not getting paid.
Mm-hmm.
This isn't, you could argue like, hey, this isn't really worth it for me, especially those kids that maybe aren't pro prospects. They just,
Mm-hmm.
what's the risk? Like
Right.
why should I put myself in harm's way for something that it's not going to pay off.
Right.
But those kids that are looking at being on the draft board this year, I can see them playing just because they don't want to slip down. They don't want to lose out on a couple extra $1 million, and I don't blame
Mm-hmm.
them. Don't get me
Mm-hmm.
wrong. But I think there will be a season. It'll be a little more watered down season, and I think they're going to have to approach the bowl games if we even have a bowl season, or at least the playoff in a bubble format. As weird as that sounds to say, I
Yeah.
think that's their best bet. And I mean, that's something that Major League Baseball should have been doing. That's a whole different discussion. We don't have to get into that, but I think they should have gone to a bubble.
Yeah.
Um, but college football, especially for the Bulls and for the playoff, they're going to have to change something,
Mm-hmm.
whether that's have all three games, the two semifinals and the national championship game all in one location, just so that way you're not traveling all over the country like you are in a normal year. But I think there will be a season. I think we're going to see a lot more kids opt out in the coming weeks. And it's going to be a little weird this year, a little more watered down. So
Mm-hmm.
there will be a season, but definitely some changes that we haven't even thought of yet within the coming month or so.
Yeah, that totally makes sense, and it's been a year of that. So I would expect nothing less from August, September, October, November, and December. So what a wild time. But anyway, Nate, I really appreciate the time, and good luck as you continue in your new job there in Rhinelander. And it was fun to talk to you.
Yeah, thanks for having me on today. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. Take care.
Yeah, you too. Bye bye.
That is Nate Meihak, sports reporter at WJFW-Newswatch 12 in Rhinelander, Wisconsin. You can follow him on Twitter at Nate Meihak, Meihak spelled Meihak. Really appreciate his time and really appreciate his perspective on local sports and what he's doing right now with news and sports and how he goes about finding the stories. I thought that was really interesting about how he goes into and tries to find the deeper stories, right? The stories that are going to mean something to the people and not just highlights every night. It's finding out the stories behind the athletes that play the games. And I think we see that a lot of in evening news, and it was kind of interesting to go behind the scenes of how that comes about. So again, thank you to Nate for joining me today. And thank you to you for watching and listening to another podcast. I'll be back next week as we continue here in August, which is unreal. And the fall sports season is coming up upon us, and if we get NFL here, we're gonna have all four major sports at the same time, which would be wild. But we'll just continue to plug away here on the Hunter Baumgardt Sports Podcast. So like I've mentioned, follow along. I'll update you on the podcast, release them all, and keep you updated on my social media accounts at Hunter B on Air on both Twitter and Instagram. You can also like the Facebook page, Hunter Baumgardt Sports. And remember, you can watch or listen to the podcast. You can watch on YouTube or listen on SoundCloud. Simply search Hunter Baumgardt Sports Podcast. Well, thanks again for watching or listening. We'll talk to you next week. And as always, stay positive.